Why is Putin so obsessed with Crimea? Why was the US destined to become a global superpower? Why does China's power base continue to expand? Why is Tibet destined to lose its autonomy? Why will Europe never be united? The answers are geographical. In an ever more complex, chaotic, and interlinked world, Prisoners of Geography is a concise and useful primer on geopolitics, and a critical guide to one of the major determining factors in world affairs. Hi! It is Sunday, April 14th. I have been sick the past few days, and so I decided to just stay in this weekend and get lots of reading done. Yesterday I read Our Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. I'll include that in the description box. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about Prisoners of Geography, which is a nonfiction book by Tim Marshall. I always had been interested in foreign politics and international affairs, and what this book really showed me is that there tends to be an element that is missing when there's analysis done on foreign policy, and that's the idea of geography. So going through the table of contents in this book: introduction, Russia, China, United States, Western Europe, Africa, the Middle East, India and Pakistan, Korea and Japan, Latin America, and then the Arctic. So usually I start these reviews by talking about the positive, but I want to make sure that people are aware of the negatives first, because this book has quite a number of flaws, and they're mainly due to the author's own bias. So I wanted to update my Goodreads status after I'd finished reading this book, and I came across this really amazing review by a man named Thomas Ray. The review was excellently written, and after reading it, I immediately followed Mr. Ray. So I want to quote some of the comments made in Mr. Ray's review, because he put into words some of the flaws of this book in a really excellent way. And Mr. Ray gave this book 2 stars. He starts off by saying, "This is actually a rather shallow, cursory look at geopolitics from a standard pro-US military neoliberal viewpoint." He then goes on to say, "The author buys the idea that there are national interests as distinct from the interests of particular centers of power, and that we have to respond militarily to perceived threats, to our ability to project power everywhere and to counter the threat of violence by locals. No awareness that U.S. military presence is a threat that provokes violence. To the author, the world is a chessboard, control of fossil fuels a game. The unstated presumption is what's good for Exxon, United Fruit, Raytheon is the U.S. natural interest." He then goes on to talk about flaws in different chapters of the book. He starts by looking at the author's chapter on Latin America. Latin America lags far behind economically, in part because they got the politics wrong. He means some of them tried to resist total control by U.S. corporations, and that the U.S. military, CIA, State Department, and corporate and financial sectors have all worked very hard to keep Latin America an exploited region without autonomy. He then goes on to quote this book, which I actually have been wanting to read, by Eduardo Galeano, and that shows that Mr. Ray knows his stuff. Next, he criticizes the author's chapter about the Middle East. To the author, idiots think the problems of the Middle East are due to Israel, and that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is merely a joint tragedy, rather than, say, genocide, apartheid, theft of the country from the Palestinians by Israel. He then criticizes certain omissions made by the author in the book. The military is the real power in Egypt. No mention that the U.S. provided that power, much less in whose interest. On the Iran-Iraq war, no mention that the U.S. armed both sides. Finally, he criticizes some of the author's comments about Mexico. To this author, Mexico is a problem for America, supplying illegal labor and drugs. No mention of U.S. dumping of government-subsidized agricultural commodities, destroying livelihoods of farmers all over the world. No suggestion that it's U.S. drug law and enforcement that's the problem causing suffering throughout the hemisphere. I just think when it comes to this idea of re-educating and decolonizing the mind, it's really important to notice the flaws in a book and see the bias of the author. For me, some of the things that Mr. Ray mentioned in his review, I actually was not aware of, so I couldn't even talk about that being particular flaws in the book, which is why I wanted to bring attention to his review. Now back to the video. The chapters that I enjoyed the most were at the beginning of the book, and when I went back to look at the table of contents as I was preparing for this video, I realized that the first few chapters were focused on one country in particular, whereas the later chapters focused on, a lot of the time, the continent or a few different countries. And I just don't think those chapters were as strong. I think when you're trying to explain the geography, politics, history of a region, you end up lacking in a lot of details because it's just far too large of a scope. For example, the chapter about Africa, while it was interesting, Africa has so many countries, and even when you just think of geography, the geography is so different across the whole continent. So it just, to me, really did it a disservice by trying to fit everything into one chapter. So this is a 9-hour audiobook, so I'm not going to go through all of the little bits and pieces, but a few points that really stood out to me when I was listening to the audiobook in the chapter about Russia, and it was talking about Stalin decided the borders of the stands, and that's like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and the borders were intentionally drawn by Stalin in such a way so that there would be a large number of minorities in each country, which would then weaken the country as a whole. I found that really fascinating because sometimes people make comments like, how come this country has been successful while these countries haven't? And how come these countries have been able to pull themselves out of poverty while this country hasn't? Well, if borders are being made artificially and strategically in such a way to end up causing certain countries to just like automatically be less successful, then you have your answer there and then. It was similar with the chapter that was talking about Africa and how so many of the times the borders that were drawn by the colonizers have resulted in these countries really suffering post-independence. And it gave an example of the Congo. I didn't realize the Congo had such a large population, and it consists of 200 tribes, and hearing that, it just makes me think, how is a country like that possibly going to be able to survive? Like, it's doomed to fail. One other aspect that really stood out to me when I was listening to this audiobook, I felt the same way when I was listening to Our Prisons Obsolete. I feel like capitalism is the cause of so many problems. So in certain instances, powerful countries such as America, China, and previously Russia will support dictators just because it helps their financial interests. It gave the example of China and Sudan. So it seems like Sudan as a country does most of its trade with China. And for that reason, China is much more likely to support Sudan when it comes to things in the UN, despite Sudan's horrible record of violence against its citizens. It's sad that so many of the problems in the world are due to profit and money. I think my favorite chapter was the chapter on the United States. One part of the chapter that I found really interesting and that I want to look into more was the creation of states like Texas. So in the chapter, it says that when people were coming over to America, people were actually encouraged to move to both sides of the border because originally Texas was part of Mexico. And what happened is you have loads of white people moving into Texas, and then eventually there is a revolution that happens and the white Texans end up driving out the Mexicans who reside there. As I was listening to that chapter, it immediately made me think of what's going on in Israel-Palestine, because I know a lot of people say that part of the reason why America supports Israel is because America has used settler colonialism to drive out the locals as a way to create it as a country. As I was listening to this section that was talking about what happened in Texas, I believe it's called the Texas Revolution, I really saw the parallels. So that is an area I want to learn a little bit more about. The last part that stood out to me, and this is more just like an interesting tidbit, which I think I had known, I just completely forgotten about. In the chapter about China, it was talking about Taiwan, and I didn't remember that during the Chinese Civil War, you have Mao and the communists fighting against the nationalists, who I believe the leader was Chiang Kai-shek. And when Mao and the communists end up winning, the nationalists flee to Taiwan. Just really interested to learn more about the history of Taiwan and the interest in being separate from China. In that same chapter, it was talking about the fact that right now Taiwan sort of isn't necessarily part of China, but China wants it to become so. And so when you look at things such as Hong Kong, in certain instances, China might choose to not be as repressive as it would be, let's say, in China itself, because it wants to entice Taiwan be part of China, and the way to do that is to avoid seeming like a very repressive regime. So I listened to this book as an audiobook, and I actually listened to this and didn't have a physical book with me. And if you watched my discussion in Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis, I talked about an audiobook strategy I used to read that book. I used a slightly different strategy for this one. I got the audiobook. When I started listening to it, I realized while there is information that's useful that I think could be helpful to go back and listen to again, I didn't really feel like I loved the book, so I didn't feel like it was necessary to purchase the ebook or get a physical copy of it. So what I did instead is, when certain concepts stood out to me, I would just take notes. And I like to take notes in Notion, but you can easily just use any app that's on your phone. I was looking a little bit into the author. It seems like he's a journalist, and I believe he's British. So every time I'm reading these books, I'm always thinking about the potential bias that the author themselves may have. So I will take everything he said when it comes to certain countries such as China and Russia with a little bit of a pinch of salt. The first 3 chapters are very worth your while. I didn't really think the chapters that were talking about more than one country or talking about the continent as a whole were as strong, but still an interesting read if you are at all interested in how geography impacts sort of politics and foreign policy. I do think I will explore more books about this concept of geopolitics, but probably focus in on a particular region. So if anyone has any recommendations, I've decided to do things on my channel a little bit differently. I've just been finding when I have a list of like 10 books to get through, I get a little bit overwhelmed and I don't end up doing it. So I'm just trying to do these videos more in sort of like a vlog chatty format. But this way I actually do film the videos instead of all of the books that I read from January to March. I haven't really done anything about them, but I will try and fix that moving forward. So this channel is all about re-education and decolonizing the mind. I am currently on a journey of reading and learning lots of new things, and I decided to make this channel as a way to share what I'm learning with the world. If you are interested in following along with me on this journey, then feel free to subscribe. If you liked this video, if it gave you any interesting information, then feel free to give it a like, and I will see you tomorrow in the next one.